Sarah Mitchell had always believed that courage was something people either possessed or lacked entirely. She never imagined that true bravery would reveal itself in the most terrifying moment of her life, when death seemed certain and hope had all but vanished. The morning had started like any other at the frontier settlement of Cedar Creek. Sarah was hanging laundry behind her family's small cabin when she heard the thundering of horses approaching. Her father, Thomas Mitchell, was working in the fields with her two brothers, while her mother tended to baby Emma inside. The sound of hoofbeats wasn't unusual, but something about the urgency in their rhythm made Sarah pause, a wet sheet still clutched in her hands. Before she could call out to warn her family, 6 rough-looking men on horseback burst into their small clearing. These weren't the friendly traders or fellow settlers they occasionally received as visitors. Their clothes were stained with travel and something darker, their faces hard with the kind of cruelty that comes from living outside the bounds of civilization for too long. The leader, a tall man with a scraggly beard and cold gray eyes, dismounted with practiced ease. His companions followed suit, their hands resting casually on the weapons at their sides. Sarah dropped the sheet and started backing toward the cabin, but one of the men had already circled behind her, cutting off her escape route. Well, the leader said, his voice carrying a tone that made Sarah's skin crawl. Looks like we found ourselves something valuable after all. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized these men were outlaws, the kind that had been terrorizing settlements throughout the territory. Stories of their raids had reached Cedar Creek, tales of robbery, murder, and worse. She had never imagined she would face such danger herself. "Please," she managed to whisper, though her voice barely carried. "We don't have much money, but you can take whatever you want." The leader laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Money? Girl, you're worth more than any coin we might find in this pitiful place." The meaning behind his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had heard whispers about young women being taken, sold to distant camps or worse fates. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to remain standing. If she was going to die or worse, she wouldn't give these monsters the satisfaction of seeing her collapse in terror. The sound of her father's voice calling her name from the fields gave her a moment of hope, but it quickly turned to horror as she realized he was walking straight into danger. The outlaws heard him too, and 2 of them moved to positions where they could ambush her family members. "Papa, stay back." Sarah screamed with all her strength, hoping to warn him. "Run!" Her cry was cut short as one of the men grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. But her warning had been heard. Through the trees, she could see her father freeze, then quickly duck behind the cover of the cornstalks. At least he knew now that something was wrong. "Smart girl," the leader said, though his tone suggested he wasn't pleased with her warning. But not smart enough. What happened next unfolded like a nightmare. The outlaws moved with the efficiency of men who had done this before. They systematically searched the cabin, taking what little of value the Mitchell family possessed. Sarah watched helplessly as they stuffed her mother's jewelry, their small savings, and even basic supplies into their saddlebags. But the worst part was yet to come. As they prepared to leave, the leader made it clear that Sarah would be coming with them. The other men discussed their plans in voices just loud enough for her to hear, describing how they would use her as bait in their next scheme. "The Cherokee have been tracking us for weeks," one of them said. "They want the horses we took from their village. Well, let them come. We'll set a trap they won't be able to resist." Sarah's blood ran cold as she understood their plan. They intended to use her as bait to draw the Cherokee warriors into an ambush. She would be tied up in the open, helpless and exposed, while the outlaws waited in hiding with their rifles ready. "No," she said, finding her voice again. "You can't do this. I won't be part of your murderous schemes." The leader backhanded her across the face, the sharp crack of the impact echoing through the clearing. Stars exploded across Sarah's vision, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. "You'll do exactly what we say, girl," he snarled, "or your family will pay the price. We know where they're hiding, and we can come back anytime we want." The threat to her family was more effective than any physical violence could have been. Sarah knew these men were capable of carrying out their promises. She had no choice but to comply, at least for now. As they bound her hands and lifted her onto one of their horses, Sarah caught a glimpse of her father's face peering through the cornstalks. The anguish in his eyes was almost more than she could bear. She tried to give him a reassuring look, though she felt anything but reassured herself. The ride that followed was a blur of pain and terror. The outlaws pushed their horses hard, putting distance between themselves and Cedar Creek. Sarah's wrists were raw from the rough rope that bound them, and every jarring step of the horse sent waves of discomfort through her body. But physical pain was nothing compared to the fear that gnawed at her mind. She kept thinking about what awaited her at their destination. The Cherokee warriors these men spoke of weren't the enemy in her eyes. They were people defending themselves against thieves and murderers, yet she would be used as a weapon against them, an innocent pawn in a deadly game. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the outlaws finally called a halt. They had reached their chosen location, a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. It was the perfect spot for an ambush, with multiple escape routes for the attackers and no cover for anyone caught in the open. Sarah watched in growing horror as the men began preparing their trap. They drove a wooden stake deep into the ground at the center of the clearing, testing its strength with satisfied nods. This was where they would tether her, leaving her exposed and vulnerable while they waited in the shadows with their weapons. "Please," Sarah said one final time, though she knew it was useless. "Don't do this. Find another way." The leader looked at her with something that might have been pity if it had come from a different man. "Girl, you're the only currency we have that the Cherokee might value. Your life for the return of their horses and safe passage out of their territory. It's a fair trade." But Sarah knew there would be no fair trade. These men had no intention of honoring any agreement. They planned to take their revenge on the Cherokee warriors, using her as the perfect bait to draw them into the open where they could be cut down by rifle fire. As darkness fell over the wilderness, Sarah found herself tied to the stake alone and terrified, waiting for dawn and whatever fate awaited her. The night passed with agonizing slowness for Sarah Mitchell. Tied to the wooden stake in the center of the clearing, she could do nothing but listen to the sounds of the wilderness around her and pray that somehow, some way, she would survive the coming day. The rope around her wrist had been tied tight enough to prevent escape but loose enough to allow blood flow. The outlaws weren't completely stupid. They needed their bait to look alive and desperate when the Cherokee arrived. A corpse wouldn't serve their purpose. Throughout the dark hours, Sarah had plenty of time to think about her situation. The 6 outlaws had positioned themselves in the tree line around the clearing, each man armed with a rifle and plenty of ammunition. They had chosen their hiding spots carefully, creating overlapping fields of fire that would turn the open space into a killing ground. Their leader, who Sarah had heard the others call Morrison, had explained their strategy with the casual cruelty of a man who had done such things before. The Cherokee warriors who had been tracking them were skilled fighters, but they were honorable people who wouldn't leave an innocent woman to die if they could help it. That honor would be their downfall. "They'll try to rescue you," Morrison had told her as his men finished their preparations. "And when they step into this clearing, we'll cut them down like wheat before a scythe. After that, we'll have all the time we need to get clear of Cherokee territory." Sarah had wanted to scream at him, to tell him that his plan was monstrous and cowardly. But she had learned that speaking only earned her more abuse. Instead, she had remained silent, using the time to study her captors and look for any possible weakness in their plan. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Sarah heard movement in the forest around her. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that the Cherokee had found them. Morrison and his men had left a trail that wasn't difficult to follow, and the warriors had tracked them through the night. The outlaws tensed in their hiding places, fingers moving to the triggers of their weapons. Sarah wanted to cry out a warning, to somehow alert the approaching Cherokee to the danger they faced. But Morrison had anticipated this possibility. Before positioning himself in the tree line, he had made it clear that any attempt to warn their enemies would result in immediate death. "You make one sound," he had whispered in her ear, his breath hot and foul, "and I'll put a bullet in you before the echo dies." The Cherokee might still try to rescue a wounded woman, but they sure won't bother with a dead one. Now, as she heard the soft sounds of movement growing closer, Sarah faced an impossible choice. She could remain silent and watch innocent people walk into a massacre, or she could try to warn them and die for the attempt. Either way, blood would be spilled because of her. The Cherokee appeared at the edge of the clearing like ghosts materializing from the morning mist. Sarah counted 5 warriors, each moving with the fluid grace of men who had spent their lives in the wilderness. They wore a mixture of traditional clothing and practical items acquired through trade. their faces painted for war but their eyes reflecting caution rather than bloodlust. The leader of the Cherokee band was a man in his 30s with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair tied back with leather cord. He raised his hand, signaling for his companions to stop at the tree line while he studied the situation. Sarah could see him taking in every detail of the clearing, from her position at the stake to the too convenient cover provided by the surrounding trees. He knew it was a trap. The realization filled Sarah with a mixture of hope and terror. If the Cherokee leader was smart enough to recognize the ambush, perhaps his people wouldn't all die in the next few minutes. But that also meant they might simply leave her to her fate rather than risk walking into obvious danger. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The Cherokee warriors remained motionless at the forest's edge, while the hidden outlaws waited for them to step into the open. Sarah found herself holding her breath, afraid that even the sound of her breathing might somehow trigger the violence that hung in the air like smoke. Finally, the Cherokee leader stepped forward, but only a single pace. He spoke in a clear voice that carried easily across the clearing, his English heavily accented but perfectly understandable. "We know you are there, white men. We have come for what you stole from our people, not to make war. Release the woman, and we will allow you to leave our lands unharmed." Morrison's response came from his hiding place in the form of a harsh laugh. "You're in no position to make demands, Cherokee. You want the girl? Come and get her. We'll be happy to reunite you with your ancestors." The Cherokee leader's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see his jaw tighten slightly. He turned and spoke rapidly to his companions in their own language. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably that of a man giving orders. What happened next surprised everyone, including Sarah. Instead of retreating or charging blindly into the trap, the Cherokee began to spread out along the tree line. They moved with purpose and coordination, each warrior taking a position that would allow them to provide covering fire for the others. Morrison had made a critical error in his planning. He had assumed that the Cherokee would be driven by emotion, that their desire to rescue an innocent woman would override their tactical judgment. But these were experienced warriors who had survived countless battles precisely because they knew how to think clearly under pressure. "What are they doing?" Sarah heard one of the outlaws whisper from his hiding place. "Shut up," Morrison hissed back. "They're just trying to spook us. When they realize we won't fall for their games, they'll have to come into the open." But the Cherokee had no intention of playing by Morrison's rules. One of the warriors had circled around to a position where he could see two of the hidden outlaws. Another had found a vantage point that gave him a clear shot at Morrison's location. They were turning the ambush back on the ambushers. Sarah watched this deadly chess game unfold with growing amazement. These Cherokee warriors were demonstrating a level of tactical sophistication that Morrison and his men clearly hadn't expected. They moved like parts of a single organism, each anticipating what the others would do and adjusting their positions accordingly. The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Both sides waited for the other to make the first move, knowing that whoever acted first would likely determine the outcome of the entire encounter. It was Sarah who broke the stalemate, though not intentionally. A bee, attracted by the wildflowers growing near the stake, landed on her arm and stung her. The sharp pain caused her to gasp and jerk against her bonds, a sound that carried clearly in the morning air. The small noise was enough to shatter the tension. One of the outlaws, his nerves already stretched to the breaking point, fired his rifle at the Cherokee position nearest to him. The shot missed its target but sent bark flying from a nearby tree. In an instant, the clearing erupted into chaos. Rifle fire cracked from multiple positions as the outlaws tried to eliminate the Cherokee warriors they could see. But the Cherokee were no longer where Morrison expected them to be, and their return fire was devastatingly accurate. Sarah threw herself to the ground as much as her bonds would allow, pressing her face to the earth as bullets whistled overhead. She could hear men shouting, some in English and others in Cherokee, their voices mixing with the thunder of gunfire and the whistle of arrows. Through the chaos, she caught glimpses of the battle unfolding around her. The Cherokee had indeed turned the trap on its creators. Their superior knowledge of woodland fighting and their tactical preparation were proving more than a match for the outlaws' superior firepower. But Sarah was still tied to the stake in the center of it all, with bullets flying in every direction and no way to seek cover. Her life hung in the balance, dependent on the outcome of a battle she had never wanted to see begin. The gunfight that erupted around Sarah was unlike anything she had ever imagined. The carefully planned ambush had turned into a chaotic battle where death could come from any direction at any moment. Pressed flat against the ground with her face in the dirt, she could only listen to the sounds of violence and pray that a stray bullet wouldn't find her. Morrison's angry curses rose above the gunfire as he realized how badly he had underestimated his opponents. The Cherokee warriors weren't behaving like the simple savages he had expected. They fought with discipline and intelligence, using every piece of cover the forest provided while maintaining coordinated fire that kept the outlaws pinned in their positions. "Johnson, Miller," Morrison shouted to two of his men, "flank them on the right. We need to break their line." But his orders were met with silence. Sarah lifted her head just enough to see that one of the outlaws lay motionless behind a fallen log. His rifle forgotten beside him, a Cherokee arrow protruded from his chest, its fletching decorated with patterns she didn't recognize. The Cherokee leader, who had taken cover behind a massive oak tree, called out in English again, "Surrender now and we will allow you to live. Continue this fight and you will all join your friend in death." Morrison's response was a wild shot that splintered bark from the Cherokee leader's tree. "Come and take us, you red devils. We'll send every last one of you to hell." Sarah could hear the desperation in Morrison's voice. His carefully planned trap had become a nightmare, and his men were falling one by one to Cherokee arrows and rifle fire. But rather than accept defeat, he seemed determined to fight to the bitter end. Another of the outlaws cried out in pain as a Cherokee bullet found its mark. The man stumbled from his cover, clutching his shoulder, and immediately drew fire from multiple positions. He fell and didn't get up again. The battle was turning into a rout, but Sarah found no comfort in the Cherokee's apparent victory. She was still tied to the stake in the middle of the fighting, and bullets continued to whistle overhead. Neither side could risk moving into the open to help her while the other still posed a threat. From her position on the ground, Sarah caught sight of movement in the tree line to her left. One of the Cherokee warriors was working his way around the clearing, using the cover of the forest to approach Morrison's position from an unexpected angle. The man moved like a ghost, each step carefully placed to avoid making noise on the forest floor. This warrior was younger than the others, probably in his early 20s, with the lean build of someone who had spent his life running and hunting. His face was painted with lines of red and black, and he carried both a rifle and a traditional tomahawk. More importantly, his path would bring him close enough to Sarah's position that he might be able to free her. But as the young Cherokee crept closer, Sarah saw something that made her heart stop. Morrison had spotted the flanking movement and was adjusting his position to meet this new threat. He was raising his rifle, taking careful aim at the warrior who was trying to help her. Sarah faced the same impossible choice she had confronted earlier. She could remain silent and watch an innocent man die, or she could try to warn him and likely die herself. This time, however, the decision was easier. She couldn't stand by and watch someone get killed while trying to help her. "Behind you," she screamed, putting all her strength into the warning. Morrison's shot went wild as her cry startled him. The Cherokee warrior rolled behind a tree just as the bullet carved splinters from the bark, where his head had been a moment before. But Sarah's warning had cost her dearly. Morrison turned his rifle toward her with murderous rage in his eyes. "I told you what would happen if you tried to help them, girl." The rifle barrel swung toward Sarah, and she knew she had only seconds to live. She closed her eyes and thought of her family, hoping they would understand why she had chosen to act as she did. The shot that followed was deafeningly loud, but Sarah felt no impact. She opened her eyes to see Morrison stumbling backward, clutching his right arm. His rifle had fallen to the ground and blood was seeping between his fingers. The Cherokee warrior Sarah had warned was already moving, having used Morrison's moment of distraction to get a clear shot. "You are finished," the young Cherokee called out in accented English. "Your men are dead or wounded. Surrender now." But Morrison wasn't done fighting. With his left hand, he drew a pistol from his belt and fired toward the Cherokee's position. The shot missed, but it showed that he still had fight left in him. The Cherokee leader's voice carried across the clearing with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Ayanna, get the woman to safety. The rest of us will finish this." The young warrior who had been flanking Morrison's position nodded and began moving toward Sarah's stake. But he had to cross open ground to reach her, and Morrison still had his pistol. Sarah watched the young Cherokee warrior begin his dash across the clearing. He ran in a zigzag pattern, making himself as difficult a target as possible, but the open ground left him exposed. Morrison, despite his wounded arm, was taking careful aim. The distance wasn't great, perhaps 30 yards, but it might as well have been a mile with Morrison's gun pointed at the space between the Cherokee warrior and Sarah's stake. Time seemed to slow as Sarah watched the young man risk his life to save hers. Morrison fired his pistol just as the Cherokee warrior reached the halfway point. The bullet went wide, but only barely. The young man didn't break stride, continuing his headlong rush toward Sarah's position. But Morrison had a second pistol, and he was drawing it with his left hand despite his wounded right arm. This shot would be at much closer range, and even with his offhand, he was unlikely to miss. Sarah's mind raced as she watched the scene unfold. The Cherokee warrior would reach her in a few more seconds, but Morrison would have his second gun ready before then. She had to do something to help, but she was tied to a stake with no weapons and no way to fight back. Then she remembered something her father had taught her about horses. When an animal was truly frightened, it could break ropes and restraints that would normally hold it. Pure terror could give any creature strength it didn't know it possessed. Sarah began throwing herself against her bonds with desperate strength, not trying to untie the ropes but attempting to break them through sheer force. The rough hemp cut into her wrists and the stake scraped against her back, but she kept struggling. The Cherokee warrior was almost to her position when Morrison raised his second pistol. Sarah could see the outlaw's finger tightening on the trigger, could see death approaching for the man who was trying to save her life. With a final, desperate effort, Sarah threw her full weight against the ropes. Something gave way with a sharp crack and suddenly she was free. Without thinking, she rolled to the side just as Morrison fired. The bullet meant for the Cherokee warrior struck the stake where Sarah had been tied a moment before. Wood chips flew in all directions as the young Cherokee reached her position and dropped to one knee beside her. "Are you hurt?" he asked in English, his dark eyes scanning her for injuries. "No," Sarah gasped, hardly believing she was still alive. "Thank you. Thank you for saving me." The warrior nodded grimly. "We are not safe yet. Can you run?" Before Sarah could answer, Morrison appeared at the edge of the clearing, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side but his left hand still gripping his pistol. His face was twisted with rage and pain, and Sarah could see that he intended to kill them both rather than accept defeat. The young Cherokee warrior stepped protectively in front of Sarah, raising his rifle to meet this final threat. But Morrison was closer than expected, and there might not be time to aim and fire before the outlaw could use his pistol. Sarah realized that her rescue was about to turn into a tragedy, with her savior dying in the attempt to protect her. The thought was unbearable. She had already caused too much bloodshed by being used as bait in Morrison's trap. The moment stretched like an eternity as Morrison raised his pistol toward Sarah and the Cherokee warrior, who stood protecting her. The outlaw's face was a mask of pain and fury, his wounded right arm hanging useless while his left hand trembled with the effort of holding the heavy weapon steady. Sarah could see death approaching in Morrison's eyes. The man had lost everything in this failed ambush. His men were dead or dying, his carefully laid plans had crumbled, and his reputation as a feared outlaw leader was in ruins. If he was going to die in these woods, he was determined to take her and her rescuer with him. The Cherokee warrior, who Sarah had heard called Ayanna by his leader, stood perfectly still between her and Morrison's gun. His own rifle was partially raised, but Sarah could see that he wouldn't have time to aim and fire before Morrison pulled his trigger. The distance was too short, the outlaw's weapon already pointed in their direction. "You should have minded your own business, Cherokee," Morrison snarled, his finger beginning to squeeze the trigger. "Now you can die with the girl you tried to save." But Morrison had made the same mistake that had cost him the entire battle. He had forgotten about the other Cherokee warriors who were still positioned around the clearing. His focus on revenge had made him tunnel vision on Sarah and Ayanna, blocking out everything else. The arrow came from somewhere in the tree line to Sarah's right, flying straight and true with the accuracy that comes from a lifetime of practice. She saw it for just an instant as it streaked through the morning air, its stone point glinting in the filtered sunlight. Morrison's eyes widened in shock as the arrow took him in the left shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying from his nerveless fingers. He stumbled backward, looking down at the shaft protruding from his body, as if he couldn't believe what had happened. The Cherokee leader emerged from the forest, lowering the bow he had just used to save his warrior's life. His face was grim but not cruel as he approached the wounded outlaw who had caused so much pain and suffering. "It is finished," the Cherokee leader said in English, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had seen too much violence in his lifetime. "Your men are dead. You are defeated. There will be no more killing today unless you force it." Morrison fell to his knees, his face pale from blood loss and shock. The fight had gone out of him completely, leaving only a broken man who had pushed his luck too far and paid the price for his cruelty. Sarah felt Ayanna's hand on her arm, steadying her as the full impact of what had just happened began to sink in. She was alive. The Cherokee had risked their lives to save her, and somehow, miraculously, they had all survived the deadly trap that Morrison had tried to spring. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Ayanna's painted face. "You saved my life." The young warrior shook his head slightly. "We could not leave you to die for the crimes of evil men. That would make us no better than they are." The Cherokee leader approached them, his bow now slung across his back. He studied Sarah with intelligent dark eyes, taking in her torn dress, her rope-burned wrists, and the fear that she was trying hard to control. "You are hurt," he observed, "but you will live. That is what matters." "I don't understand," Sarah said, looking around at the Cherokee warriors who were now emerging from their positions in the forest. "Why did you save me?" "I'm a stranger to you. Morrison said you were tracking them because they stole your horses." The Cherokee leader nodded gravely. "That is true. These men took horses from our village and killed 2 of our young men who tried to stop them. We followed them to recover what was stolen and to bring justice for the dead. But justice does not require the death of innocents," Ayanna added, checking Sarah's bonds to make sure she was completely free. "When we saw that you were being used as bait, we knew we had to find another way." Sarah looked at Morrison, who was sitting on the ground clutching his wounded shoulder. The man who had seemed so terrifying just hours before now looked pathetic and defeated. Blood was seeping through his fingers, but the arrow hadn't hit anything vital. He would live, though Sarah wasn't sure if that was a mercy or a curse. "What will happen to him?" she asked. The Cherokee leader considered the question carefully. "That is not for us to decide. We will take him to the nearest settlement and turn him over to your lawmen. Let white justice deal with white crimes." One of the other Cherokee warriors had been checking the bodies of the fallen outlaws. He reported to his leader in their own language, and Sarah saw the older man nod grimly. 4 dead, 1 wounded, the leader told Sarah and Ayanna. They chose their fate when they chose the path of violence. As the immediate danger passed, Sarah began to realize the full scope of what the Cherokee had done for her. They could have simply waited for the outlaws to leave their territory, avoiding a costly battle entirely. Instead, they had risked their lives to save a woman they had never met, showing a kind of courage and honor that Morrison and his men could never understand. "I need to get home," Sarah said suddenly, thinking of her family. "My parents must be terrified. They'll think I'm dead." Ayanna looked to his leader, who nodded his approval. "I will take her," the young warrior said. "The others can handle the prisoner and recover our stolen horses." But as they prepared to leave the clearing, Sarah noticed that Ayanna was favoring his left arm. During the chaos of the battle, she hadn't seen him get hurt, but now she could see dark stains on his buckskin shirt. "You're bleeding," she said, pointing to his arm. Ayanna looked down at the wound as if noticing it for the first time. "A bullet grazed me when I was moving to your position. It is nothing serious." But Sarah could see that it was more than just a graze. The Cherokee warrior had been shot while trying to save her, and he was trying to hide the extent of his injury. The realization filled her with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. The Cherokee leader had also noticed his warrior's wound. He spoke rapidly in their own language, clearly giving orders for Ayanna to have his injury treated. But the young warrior shook his head stubbornly, responding in Cherokee before switching to English. "I can take her home first. The wound will wait." "No," Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "You've done enough for me already. You need to take care of that injury before it gets worse." She looked around at the Cherokee warriors, these brave men who had risked everything to save a stranger. They had shown her a kind of honor that she had never encountered before, and she knew she would carry this debt for the rest of her life. "I can find my way home from here," she continued. "Cedar Creek isn't far and the path is clear. You've all done more than enough." But even as she spoke, Sarah realized that her ordeal was far from over. She was alone in the wilderness, miles from home, with no protection except what these Cherokee warriors were willing to provide. Morrison might be defeated, but there could be other dangers between here and safety. The Cherokee leader seemed to read her thoughts. "No," he said simply. "We do not save a life only to abandon it to new dangers. Hayana will see you safely home, and then he will return for treatment of his wound." Sarah wanted to argue, but she could see that the decision was final. These people had their own code of honor, and it didn't allow them to leave a task half-finished. She would have to accept their protection, even though it meant Ayana would continue to risk his health for her sake. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Sarah took one last look at Morrison. The man was being bound by 2 Cherokee warriors, his face gray with pain and defeat. She felt no satisfaction at his downfall, only a deep weariness at the violence that seemed to follow some people wherever they went. But she was alive, and she was going home, thanks to the courage of people she had been taught to fear. The journey back to Cedar Creek began in silence, with Sarah walking beside Ayana through the dense forest that had seemed so threatening just hours before. Now, with the Cherokee warrior as her guide and protector, the same wilderness felt peaceful, almost welcoming. Birds called from the branches overhead, and sunlight filtered through the leaves in golden patches that danced across the forest floor. Ayana moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his entire life in these woods, but Sarah could see that he was struggling more than he wanted to admit. The bullet wound in his left arm was bleeding more freely now, and she noticed him occasionally pressing his right hand against it to stem the flow. "We should stop and tend to your wound," Sarah said after they had walked for about an hour. "It's getting worse." Ayana shook his head, though his face was pale beneath the war paint. "Cedar Creek is not far. I can make it that distance." But Sarah had grown up on the frontier, and she knew the dangers of untreated wounds. Infection could set in quickly, especially in the humid forest environment, and blood loss could weaken even the strongest man. "No," she said firmly, surprising herself with her determination. "You saved my life. The least I can do is help you with that injury before it gets any worse." She spotted a small stream running through a rocky depression about 50 yards to their right. The water looked clear and clean, perfect for washing a wound, and the rocks would provide a place to sit while she worked. "Please," she added when Ayana seemed ready to object, "let me help you. I know something about treating injuries." It was true. Living on the frontier meant that everyone had to learn basic medical skills, since the nearest doctor might be days away. Sarah had helped her mother tend to various cuts, burns, and other injuries that were common in their isolated community. After a moment's hesitation, Ayana nodded and allowed Sarah to guide him to the stream. He sat on one of the smooth rocks while she knelt beside the water, tearing strips of fabric from her petticoat to use as bandages. "This might hurt," she warned as she began to carefully clean the wound. Ayana didn't flinch as the cold water touched his wound, though Sarah could see his jaw tighten slightly. The bullet had carved a deep furrow along the outside of his upper arm, missing the bone but tearing through muscle and flesh. It was painful but not life-threatening if properly cared for. "You're lucky," Sarah said as she worked. "A few inches to the right and this would have shattered your arm." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Ayana replied quietly. "I chose to take that risk when I decided to help you." Sarah paused in her work, looking up at his face. "Why, you don't even know me." "Your people and mine. We haven't always been friends." Ayana was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow over the rocks. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful thought. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the early days, when the first white settlers came to our lands. There was fear on both sides and sometimes violence. But there were also moments when people chose to see past their differences, when they chose to help rather than harm." He winced slightly as Sarah applied pressure to stop the bleeding, but continued speaking. She said that those moments, those choices to show kindness to strangers, were what separated people from animals. Anyone can strike back when they are hurt or afraid. It takes wisdom to know when to extend a helping hand instead. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as she bound the wound with strips of her petticoat. She had been raised with stories about Cherokee raids and violence, tales that painted all native people as savage enemies to be feared and fought. But here was a man who had risked his life for her, speaking words of wisdom and compassion that put many of her own people to shame. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "for what my people have done to yours, For the fear and hatred between us. Ayanna looked at her with surprise. You cannot carry the guilt for actions you did not take. Just as I am not responsible for every Cherokee who has chosen the path of war. We can only control our own choices. When Sarah finished bandaging his arm, they sat by the stream for a few minutes to rest. The peaceful sound of flowing water, and the warmth of the sun filtering through. The trees created a sense of calm that seemed almost impossible after the violence of the morning. Tell me about your family, Ayanna said. They must be very worried about you. Sarah's heart clenched as she thought about her parents and brothers. My father is Thomas Mitchell. He came west 5 years ago with my mother and us children, looking for a better life. He's a good man, but he's probably organizing every settler in the territory to come looking for me right now. She paused, suddenly worried about what might happen when they reached Cedar Creek. What if they don't understand? What if they see you as a threat instead of a rescuer? It was a legitimate concern. Frontier communities were often suspicious of any Native Americans, even friendly ones. The sight of Sarah returning with a Cherokee warrior might provoke fear or even violence from people who meant well but didn't understand the situation. Ayanna had clearly thought about this possibility as well. I will take you close to your settlement and let you go the final distance alone. It is better if your people do not see me. No, Sarah said immediately. That's not right. You saved my life. You deserve their thanks, not their suspicion. But even as she spoke, Sarah knew that Ayanna's approach was probably the wiser one. Her community was filled with good people, but they were also frightened people living in a dangerous time. The sight of a Cherokee warrior might trigger panic before anyone had a chance to explain the situation. They resumed walking, following game trails that Ayanna navigated with easy familiarity. As they traveled, he pointed out various plants and their uses, sharing knowledge that his people had accumulated over generations of living in these woods. This one, he said, stopping beside a plant with distinctive leaves. We call it white man's foot, because it grows wherever your people have walked, but it is good medicine for wounds and infections. Sarah found herself fascinated by this glimpse into a different way of understanding the natural world. Her own people saw the forest as something to be conquered and cleared, but Ayanna spoke of it as a living community where everything had its place and purpose. As the afternoon wore on, they began to encounter signs of settlement. A cleared field here, the stumps of felled trees there, the distant sound of an axe biting into wood. They were approaching the edges of the territory that Cedar Creek's residents had claimed as their own. Your home is very close now, Ayanna said, pointing through the trees toward a column of smoke rising in the distance. That is from your settlement's cooking fires. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief at the prospect of seeing her family again, but sadness at the thought of parting from this remarkable man who had shown her such kindness. She realized that she might never see him again after today. I wish there was some way I could repay you, she said. You've given me my life back. Ayanna shook his head. There is no debt between us. I did what anyone should do when they see another person in danger. But Sarah knew that wasn't true. Most people, Cherokee or white, would have found ways to rationalize not getting involved. It would have been easier and safer for Ayanna and his companions to simply track the outlaws until they left Cherokee territory, rather than risk a battle to save a stranger. As they drew nearer to Cedar Creek, they began to hear voices in the distance. Sarah recognized her father's voice among them, raised in what sounded like urgent discussion. Her heart raced as she realized that he was probably organizing a rescue party. I should go alone from here, she said, though the words felt wrong even as she spoke them. Ayanna nodded. But before he could speak, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. A group of armed men was riding hard in their direction, and Sarah could see the glint of weapons in their hands. Hide, she told Ayanna urgently. They'll shoot first and ask questions later if they see you with me. But it was too late. The riders had spotted them through the trees, and Sarah could hear her father's voice calling her name. The rescue party had found them, and there was no time for Ayanna to disappear into the forest. The thunder of approaching horses grew louder as Sarah's father led his rescue party through the trees toward them. Sarah could see the determination in Thomas Mitchell's face, the same expression he wore when protecting his family from any threat. Behind him rode 6 other men from Cedar Creek, all armed with rifles and wearing the grim expressions of people prepared for violence. Papa, Sarah called out, stepping forward with her hands raised to show she was unharmed. "Papa, I'm safe." Thomas Mitchell's eyes found his daughter first, scanning her quickly for injuries. Relief flooded his weathered features when he saw that she was alive and apparently unhurt. But then his gaze shifted to Ayanna, and Sarah watched her father's expression harden with suspicion and fear. "Sarah, get away from him," Thomas ordered, his rifle coming up to point at the Cherokee warrior. "Move away from that savage right now." "No, Papa." Sarah stepped protectively in front of Ayanna, her heart hammering with fear. "You don't understand. He saved my life. He and his people rescued me from the outlaws who took me." The other men in the rescue party spread out, their weapons trained on Ayanna from multiple angles. Sarah recognized most of them as neighbors and friends, good men who would normally never harm an innocent person, but fear and years of frontier suspicion had transformed them into something dangerous. "Sarah, you don't know what you're saying," said James Crawford, one of their closest neighbors. "Those redskins probably killed the outlaws to get you for themselves. They're just as bad, maybe worse." Sarah felt anger rising in her chest at the crude words and the assumptions behind them. These people knew nothing about what had really happened, yet they were ready to kill the man who had saved her life. "That's not true," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the small clearing. "The outlaws tied me to a stake and planned to use me as bait to kill Cherokee warriors. But instead of walking into the trap, these brave men found a way to save me without getting themselves killed." Ayanna remained perfectly still behind Sarah, his hands visible and empty of weapons, but she could feel the tension in his body, the readiness to fight or flee if the situation deteriorated further. The Cherokee warrior was outnumbered and surrounded, with nowhere to run if these men decided to shoot. Thomas Mitchell's eyes never left Ayanna's face as he processed his daughter's words. Sarah could see her father struggling between his protective instincts and his ingrained distrust of Native Americans. "If what you're saying is true," Thomas said carefully, "then we're grateful for his help. But that doesn't mean we can trust him. How do we know this isn't some Cherokee trick? Because he's bleeding from a bullet wound he got while saving me." Sarah shot back, her patience finally snapping. "Look at his arm, Papa. Look at the bandages I made from my own petticoat. Does that look like a trick to you?" For the first time, the men in the rescue party seemed to notice the blood-stained cloth wrapped around Ayanna's left arm. Sarah saw doubt creeping into their expressions as they began to realize that the situation might not be what they had initially assumed. Ayanna chose that moment to speak, his voice calm and respectful despite the guns pointed at him. "I mean no harm to you or your daughter. My people tracked the outlaws who raided our village and killed our young men. When we found that they were using your daughter as bait for an ambush, we could not stand by and watch an innocent person die." Thomas studied the Cherokee warrior's face, looking for signs of deception. Sarah held her breath, knowing that her father's next words could determine whether this encounter ended in handshakes or gunfire. "What happened to the outlaws?" Thomas asked finally. "4 are dead," Ayanna replied simply. "1 is wounded and has been taken prisoner. We will turn him over to your lawmen for justice." This news seemed to have a powerful effect on the rescue party. These men had lived in fear of Morrison's gang for months, knowing that the outlaws could strike at any settlement without warning. The idea that the threat had been eliminated was almost too good to believe. "Morrison?" asked Samuel Hayes, whose own farm had been raided twice. "Is Morrison dead?" "Wounded and captured," Ayanna confirmed. "He will face justice for his crimes." Sarah watched her father's expression change as the full implications of what Ayanna was saying sank in. The Cherokee hadn't just saved his daughter. They had eliminated a threat that had terrorized the entire region. "If this is true," Thomas said slowly, lowering his rifle slightly, "then we owe you more than we can ever repay." But even as her father spoke these words, Sarah could see that not all the men in the rescue party were convinced. James Crawford still held his weapon ready, his face twisted with suspicion and prejudice. "This could all be lies," Crawford said harshly. "How do we know he didn't kill those outlaws just to get his hands on Sarah? How do we know this whole story isn't made up?" Sarah felt her temper flare at Crawford's words. The man was determined to see evil where none existed, to find reasons for hatred even when presented with evidence of heroism and kindness. "Because I was there," she said, her voice rising with anger. "Because I saw what happened with my own eyes. This man risked his life to save a stranger, and all you can do is look for reasons to doubt him." But Crawford wasn't finished. Even if he did help you, what does he want in return? Cherokee don't do anything without expecting payment. The racist assumption behind Crawford's words hung in the air like poison. Sarah saw Ayanna's jaw tighten slightly, the first sign that the Cherokee warrior's patience might have limits. Before anyone could respond, the sound of more horses approaching reached their ears. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that even more armed men were on their way. The situation was becoming more dangerous by the minute. The new arrivals turned out to be 3 more settlers, including the local minister, Reverend Williams. The Reverend was a thoughtful man who had often preached about the importance of treating all people with Christian charity, regardless of their race or background. "What's the situation here?" Reverend Williams asked as he dismounted from his horse. Thomas quickly explained what Sarah had told them about her rescue and the fate of Morrison's gang. The Reverend listened carefully, his eyes moving between Sarah and Ayanna as he processed the information. "If what Sarah says is true," the Reverend said finally, "then this man is a hero who deserves our thanks, not our suspicion." But Crawford wasn't giving up easily. "Reverend, you can't trust these people. Everyone knows the Cherokee have been raiding settlements all over the territory. And everyone knows that white men like Morrison have been murdering and stealing from native villages." Sarah shot back. "Does that make all white men criminals?" The logic of her argument was undeniable, but Sarah could see that fear and prejudice were powerful forces that didn't always yield to reason. Some of these men had made up their minds about Ayanna before they had even heard the full story. Ayanna himself seemed to recognize the danger of the situation. He spoke quietly to Sarah, his voice barely audible to the surrounding men. "I should go. My presence here is causing trouble for you and your family." "No," Sarah said firmly. "You saved my life. I won't let them drive you away like some kind of criminal." But even as she spoke, Sarah realized that Ayanna might be right. The tension in the air was growing thicker by the minute, and it would only take one frightened or prejudiced man pulling a trigger to turn this confrontation into a tragedy. The standoff continued. With weapons still pointed and temper still running high, Sarah found herself caught between 2 worlds, trying to bridge a gap that seemed too wide for words alone to cross. The tension in the forest clearing had reached a breaking point. Sarah could feel the hatred and fear radiating from some of the men, while others seemed genuinely confused about what to believe. Ayanna stood perfectly still behind her, but she knew he was calculating his chances of escape if the situation turned violent. It was Reverend Williams who finally broke the standoff, stepping forward with the calm authority that came from years of mediating disputes between strong-willed frontier families. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the forest air, "we're about to make a terrible mistake here. This young woman has told us that this Cherokee warrior saved her life, yet we're treating him like an enemy. What does that say about us as Christians and as human beings?" James Crawford shifted uncomfortably, but didn't lower his rifle. "Reverend, you don't understand the situation. You can't trust these people." "Can I?" the Reverend replied. "Then tell me, James, what exactly has this man done to threaten us? He's standing here wounded, outnumbered, with his hands empty and visible. If he meant us harm, don't you think he would have acted by now?" Sarah seized on the Reverend's words, seeing an opportunity to change the direction of the confrontation. "Papa," she said, turning to face her father directly, "you raised me to tell the truth no matter what. Have I ever lied to you about anything important?" Thomas Mitchell looked into his daughter's eyes and saw the same honesty that had been there since she was a small child. "No, Sarah, you've always been truthful with me." "Then believe me now," she said earnestly. "This man and his people saved my life when they could have simply let me die. They risked everything to fight off Morrison's gang, and one of them took a bullet doing it. If that's not heroic, then I don't know what is." She could see her father wavering, his protective instincts at war with his growing realization that his daughter was telling the truth. Thomas Mitchell was a hard man when he needed to be, but he was also fair, and Sarah could see him struggling to reconcile his prejudices with the evidence before him. It was at that moment that Ayanna made a decision that surprised everyone present. Instead of continuing to stand silently while others debated his fate, he stepped forward and began to speak. "My name is Ayanna," he said, his voice calm and clear. "It means eternal blossom in my language. I am the son of Standing Bear, a chief of the Cherokee people who has always counseled peace with the white settlers when possible." The men listened despite themselves, drawn by the dignity in Ayanna's voice and the directness of his words. 3 days ago, 6 white men raided our village, he continued. They killed 2 of our young men and stole 12 horses. My father could have declared war. He could have sent warriors to attack your settlements in revenge. Instead, he chose to send a small party to track the thieves and recover what was stolen. Sarah watched the faces of the rescue party as Ayanna spoke. She could see some of their hostility beginning to fade, replaced by uncertainty and perhaps even respect for the young Cherokee's courage in speaking so openly. When we found that these criminals were using an innocent woman as bait for an ambush, we had a choice, Ayanna went on. We could have waited for them to leave our territory, avoiding a fight that might cost Cherokee lives. Or we could risk everything to save a stranger. He paused, his dark eyes moving from face to face among the armed men surrounding him. We chose to save her, not because we expected reward or thanks, but because it was the right thing to do. If you cannot accept that truth, then there is nothing more I can say. The forest fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the leaves. Sarah held her breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether this encounter ended in friendship or tragedy. It was her father who spoke first. Thomas Mitchell slowly lowered his rifle, his expression thoughtful and troubled. I've spent 5 years on this frontier believing that all Indians were my enemies, he said quietly. But if what my daughter says is true, then I've been wrong about some things. He took a step toward Ayanna, his weathered hand extended. I don't know if I can change the way I think overnight, but I know enough to recognize courage when I see it. Thank you for saving my daughter's life. Ayanna looked at the offered hand for a moment, then reached out with his uninjured arm to clasp it firmly. The simple gesture seemed to break some invisible barrier that had been standing between the 2 men. You are welcome, Ayanna said simply. A father's love for his child is something any man can understand, regardless of the color of his skin. One by one, the other members of the rescue party began to lower their weapons. Not all of them looked happy about it, and Sarah could see that men like James Crawford would probably never fully accept what had happened here. But the immediate danger was passing. Reverend Williams stepped forward with a smile on his face. Young man, I'd like to invite you to visit our settlement as our guest. I think there are people there who could learn something from your example. But Ayanna shook his head politely. I am grateful for the invitation, but I must return to my people. They will be worried about my safety, just as you were worried about Sarah's. Sarah felt a pang of sadness at his words, knowing that this was probably the last time she would ever see him. Will you be all right? Your wound needs proper care. My grandmother is skilled in the healing arts, Ayanna assured her. She will know how to treat this injury properly. As the group prepared to separate, Sarah realized that she couldn't let Ayanna leave without saying something more. This encounter had changed her understanding of the world in ways she was still trying to process. I want you to know, she said, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear, that I'll never forget what you and your people did for me, and I'll make sure that others know the truth about Cherokee honor and courage. Ayanna smiled, the first time Sarah had seen him truly smile since they had met. Perhaps someday our peoples will find a way to live as neighbors instead of enemies. Understanding must start somewhere. With those words, he turned and disappeared into the forest with the same silent grace that had marked all his movements. Within moments, it was as if he had never been there at all, leaving only the memory of his courage and the hope that his words might prove prophetic. As Sarah rode home with her father and the other men, she knew that she had been forever changed by her ordeal. She had seen the worst of humanity in Morrison and his outlaws, but she had also seen the best in Ayanna and his Cherokee companions. The experience had taught her that courage, honor, and compassion were not limited by race or culture, but were universal qualities that could be found in any human heart brave enough to embrace them. Years later, when tensions between Cherokee and white settlers reached their peak, Sarah would remember this day and work to build bridges of understanding between the 2 communities. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of evening, she would wonder what had become of the young Cherokee warrior who had stepped forward to catch an arrow meant for her, and in doing so had saved far more than just her life.